Hello, hello, Likeability family. I'm excited to introduce to you Dr. Max Gulhane, our guest speaker today. Dr. Max is a practicing Australian health optimizing physician and health educator. He worked in general and emergency medicine in Melbourne, New South Wales, and Queensland before moving to Albury, New South Wales in 2023 to commence general practice training and work under Dr. Robert Szabo at the Gardens Medical Group. Dr. Max's current focus of work includes metabolic disease reversal, circadian and quantum biology, low carbohydrate and carnivore nutrition, fertility and pregnancy optimization, endocrine disrupting chemicals, food system decentralization, and regenerative farming with an emphasis on Nguni cattle. Dr. Max hosts the Regenerative Health podcast, interviewing world-leading doctors, health practitioners, and regenerative farmers on the above topics and how to promote decentralized solutions to the new modern normal of chronic disease and high chemical input monocrop farming. He also promotes grassroots and community solutions to these challenges through Regenerate, in-person holistic health summits held in rural and urban Australia that connect, educate, and empower people to take charge of their own health. I hope you enjoy today's episode. Welcome, Dr. Max Gulhane, to the Likeability podcast. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your wisdom, which allows people to explore and embody various strategies so that they can create a more meaningful life for themselves. I'd love for us to start off with you sharing a little bit about what the term decentralized means and how it relates to the healthcare system.
It's a very important question. And the way I think about it is that now and for a very long time, the messages around health, whether that's medical treatment guidelines, whether that's dietary guidelines, they've been essentially channeled through what we would call a centralized body, and what that could be is a institute or a university system or a government guideline body. And what the implications of this is that there's been introductions of or influences on the advice that people end up getting. And to give maybe the most clear example of this is, say, the dietary guidelines in Australia, America, anywhere else. They have a very strict set of precepts, and what I, as a clinician interested in lifestyle, and what others have noticed is that if patients follow these guidelines that are essentially issued from this centralized body, then people don't optimize their health. They in fact get sicker, and they get metabolic disease, and they feel generally less optimally than they could. So, and what I think the implication of this is that there's basically influence being happening on these guidelines that are kind of separating us from what perhaps actually works and what actually people say, for example, should be eating. And if you look back at the ancestral history of humans, what we ate is very, very different to what we're being told to eat. And to give a specific example, this idea of grains, nuts, and seeds, this Garden of Eden, almost vegetarian-esque diet, and a push towards a plant-based diet, that is kind of what we're getting from these centralized bodies. And they are influencing things like the food that gets recommended by dietetics associations, by diabetic associations, so forth. So there's a real top-down approach to essentially health recommendations. That is a centralized system. But looking through a range of data like paleoanthropological data and then looking at what people actually thrive on from a dietary point of view. You put seafood and predominantly animal based protein and fat in front of people, and the health problems reverse. So there's a disconnect, and a decentralized health system is one that doesn't essentially channel their advice through a small number of people or a small group of institutions that have various interests that color that information. And again, harping on the dietary analogy or example, is that the Seventh Day Adventist Church has basically had a whole bunch to do with an influence on what people are eating, and this idea that they should be going towards vegan and vegetarianism. Look, diet's only one of these examples. Another example you could give is the research funding, and in the US, their biggest research arms, the NIH, and for basically since the 1970s, when Richard Nixon declared a war on cancer, they have been studying specifically the nuclear genome, or the genes that exist inside the nucleus, in an attempt to try and fix chronic health conditions like cancer. And how many countless billions of dollars have been spent through the centralized research system that's deciding how to allocate research funding. And I mean, you only need to look around in this country and basically every country around the world to realize that this research money, yes, it's improved outcomes of late presenting disease and severe conditions, but from a chronic health point of view, people are sicker than ever. So the question is, what is that money being spent on, and is that centralized approach to funding research the most effective? And the answer, in my opinion, is no, because it's misplaced and should be spent on, instead of the nuclear genome, the mitochondrial genome, which is this a smaller set of genes that exist inside the mitochondria, of which are these organelles that make power and energy and transform energy for us in all our cells. So that is an example of how interests, and particularly you could look at things like pharmaceutical interests, they benefit from focusing on, say, a nuclear genome, so that they can understand better druggable targets for chronic diseases, whereas a more decentralized approach, and one that is instead of looking for something like a pharmaceutical solution, is more looking at the root cause of say chronic disease, or why people are falling sick. That decentralized solution is going to be one that is exploring completely different areas, and areas like circadian biology, like quantum biology, like ancestral nutrition, to arrive at a more holistic approach that actually reverses and prevents disease. So the reason why this centralized system has proliferated, well, there's many layers to it, but essentially, the way that funding and science has been set up, and then health and medicine has been influenced by, say, the pharmaceutical industry, it's all in service of basically of profit. And that those economic incentives and things like regulatory capture, where there's influence of industry on government regulations, have all favored these kind of centralized institutions and centralized approaches. So, I guess decentralized health and is an antidote to that. It's a pendulum swinging the opposite way, and it is trying to emphasize that the solutions to our health problems can emerge from a grassroots and a decentralized way, by individuals basically looking at scientific data, looking at the fundamentals of how cells operate, light dark cycles, circadian biology. What are the fundamental inputs into life, and how can we understand and basically reverse engineer disease once we understand those fundamental inputs? And no one makes money off that, and that is essentially why centralized science hasn't essentially found cures to these diseases that are plaguing more and more people. So that is how I think about decentralized versus centralized health. One is very much influenced and has a financial input with a whole bunch of third party interests, whereas a decentralized approach is looking at the problem fundamentally and really has a no profit motive other than the doctor patient, and that lack of interference on the relationship of the doctor and the patient, I think, is going to get people better care and better advice, because there's no hospital system, there's no insurance system, there's no pharmaceutical interests involved in that relationship.
And so, just going back to something that you said about the genetic research that's being done, if I'm to gather what you've said in a nutshell, then would you say that centralized healthcare is based on research that's about RNA, DNA, whereas the decentralized system is more about the mitochondrial health rather than actually altering or re-altering the genetic makeup of someone to map back to what the ancestry was like?
Yeah, and another way of framing this was when the human genome was sequenced in the early 2000s. There was this thought that once we understood the genetic code, then we would be able to make small changes that would allow humans to grow wings, and then we would be able to make all these very small but changes that would directly, almost mechanistically, result in a disease, a massive disease phenotype change, or create individual drugs that were really targeted to specific genes. And that has happened to a certain degree. Certain cancer drugs are really targeted to certain gene mutations or polymorphisms. But this promise of a complete radical transformation of how medicine would be operate, it didn't materialize. And the reason was because it turns out the real story of how disease is manifesting and how genes are actually expressed is dependent on on cellular bioenergetics, and it's dependent on essentially mitochondrial function and how well the mitochondria are essentially operating. And mitochondria, which again I'll remind everyone, are these essentially ancient bacteria that became internalized into cells and did this very, very unique division of labor to allow the cell to put its energy generation role into these mitochondria. They dictate how so many of the most functional outcomes of the cell, particularly things like apoptosis or controlled cell death, and basically also how those genes in the nuclear genome are expressed. So if their mitochondria are sick, if they're inefficient, if they're not working properly, then that's going to essentially affect. There's going to have epigenetic effects, so and essentially going to affect how those genes in the nucleus get turned on or off. So, this is fast forward to where we are now, and despite its lack of research, there is a small and growing area of research on cellular bioenergetics and mitochondrial medicine, which has shown that things like cancer, they're a mitochondrial disease, and you can do these cellular transplants where you have you essentially transplant broken DNA. You've got a diseased cell that has broken mitochondria but a healthy nucleus, and you transplant the diseased mitochondria into the healthy into the cell without any nuclear genetic mutation, and you're still going to get a diseased phenotype. And the point being that it's the mitochondria that are essentially calling the shots about how the body is getting sick or not. And that gets to this idea that chronic disease that we care about, whether it's heart disease, neurodegenerative diseases like Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease, other metabolic diseases like type 2 diabetes and chronic kidney disease, they're essentially different flavors of mitochondrial dysfunction. And as the power drops in the mitochondrial colony, almost like a brownout. So a blackout obviously is when the lights go out completely, but a brownout is when the lights start dimming. That when that happens in different organs, it will essentially cause a disease. That's how disease manifests. So, and tying that back to this idea of the different genetic codes is that you're not. How do you influence mitochondrial health and improve essentially the mitochondrial colony so that you're less likely to develop one of these chronic diseases? And the answer turns out that you really have to change your environment, and you have to change the environmental inputs that you're living in, and you're never going to be able to drug your way to optimal mitochondrial health. And you're not going to be able to get as good an outcome for health as drugging say some other nuclear gene problem, unless there's a very small number of diseases which are primarily as a result of a genetic problem in the nucleus.
Mm-hmm. And so that's a great segue into the role of quantum biology in mitochondrial health, and reminding our listeners the mitochondria are pretty much our energy centers. So if you could shed some light on what is the role of light, water, and magnetism on the mitochondria, and how important is that compared to things like diet, movement, sleep, and whether you can give us a bit of a comparison in terms of the benefits of focusing on the quantum biology side of things.
Yeah, and so this idea is of quantum biology, I think, is the real answer that the people who were studying or tried to sequencing the human genome were really looking for. And what I see it is where there were the centralized institutions looking in that nuclear genome compared to decentralized researchers who are individually and together understanding more and more about how the mitochondria are working, and that's fundamentally a decentralized research effort. So quantum biology is essentially the study of quantum mechanical processes that are essentially happening in the body, and the mitochondrion ends up becoming the center of understanding these processes, because it's dealing with those fundamental particles of protons and electrons in the process of energy generation. And energy generation is this idea this process where the organism or the mitochondrion builds a gradient, and a proton gradient, and it uses that gradient to spin a tiny nanomotor at 9,000 revolutions per minute to essentially make ATP, which is one part of how the cell operates all the important functions that allow us to do what we do. So the way that this tiny little mitochondrial engine works is that it essentially relies on external signals, and those are the inputs into the mitochondrial electron transport chain, and those are what you mentioned in terms of light, water, and magnetism, and it's been Dr. Jack Kruse who's really popularized that, or framed the health optimization as this three-legged stool built on light, water, and magnetism. And what those three functions are essentially the three functions of what life needs to essentially be propagated and exist. And without those three, then you're not going to get a sustainable. You're not going to get any form of complex life that sustains itself. So, external light, and this is light, solar photons. They directly impact or get absorbed by the different complexes on the electron transport chain to influence the function. And they are particularly, things like red wavelength light and near infrared get absorbed by the fourth cytochrome, cytochrome C, the fourth complex, to essentially increase its ability um, to operate. And likewise with the fifth, the ATPase, that ability of it to spin efficiently is aided by the absorption of light. So, and not only that, is other inputs that are important are and relevant are water, and actually water in itself is a chromophore. It's actually absorbing light too. So, and not only that, but the mitochondrion is producing water, and that's a consequence of its function. And people can think of the exhaust pipe of mitochondrial metabolism um, as so basically going in, you've got like a carbon chain, and coming out is CO2 and water, and that's the opposite of photosynthesis. And photosynthesis takes atmospheric carbon dioxide and water and fixes it into a carbon chain, which then becomes a grass blade, and then that grass blade gets eaten by, say, a cow or a ruminant animal, and then we eat it. So, and under this light, water, and magnetism way of thinking about health, is that food in and of itself is basically light, but that's had its energy transformed into essentially into a different form. And this idea that you can't create or destroy energy, it just gets transformed. So this everything you're eating is in effect a product of photosynthesis, and the making sure that there's congruence between the light that you're exposing your body to and the light that is the food that you're eating. That is under theoretical quantum biology, that is an important thing to make sure is equal, so that there is that you're not sending confusing messaging, so to speak, between the electrons that you're feeding into the electron transport chain from food and the light that you're receiving in your local area. And then when it comes to magnetism, that's a very, very interesting topic, and I'm no expert on the effect of magnetism on mitochondria, but speaking to some of these researchers who are looking at the effect of human spaceflight, is that when you remove a magnetic field, or you put a human into a situation where there's no magnetic field, it's affecting the spin state of electrons, and that is having massive consequences for the ability of the mitochondrion to operate efficiently. So, and those things, the light and the water and the magnetism, when they're optimized, then the mitochondrial health is optimized. And when the mitochondrial health is optimized, you're essentially dying the slowest death possible. You're postponing death as long as you as slowly as you can. But when those mitochondria start breaking because you're under artificial light instead of natural sunlight, or if you have a broken circadian rhythm, which is absolutely key to ensuring regeneration of the mitochondria, especially at nighttime, and if you have if the mitochondria are operating, you're not generating abundant amount of that deuterium depleted mitochondrial water, metabolic water, then, or you're in a situation where you're not grounded, and grounding is another source of free electrons, then you're going to be in a situation where your mitochondria are not operating properly, and that's leading to disease. So to answer the question about the relative proportions of like what to do with this information, and how should we live our lives based on it, and although the science is complex and seems to be ever growing in its complexity, the really the actionable advice is quite simple, which is be exposed to or live a lifestyle where you can collect information from your environment all as much as possible to feed in to your mitochondrial colony so that they can operate most efficiently. And that simply involves um, being in the morning environment, exposed to natural sunlight, exposed to um, the temperature fluctuations of that environment, and consuming the most local food, which, as I mentioned, is a part of the can be thought of as a part of the light story. So, um, when I think and look, I'm not of the opinion that if we that we can just disregard the importance of food. I think it is important, and it's actually, in my opinion, relatively more important if we are living in this modern environment where we can't control our environmental and light signals. So, my advice or my to everyone is simply live that lifestyle that's as exposed as possible to your ambient environmental conditions, and eat as locally as possible of just whole foods that grew and were raised in the area.
So, if someone's experiencing a chronic health condition and they expose themselves to some of these topics that we're talking about, like natural light, grounding to get the electrolytes, how important is it then that the food that they consume, whether it's a vegetarian diet or a carnivore diet, is relevant then? Because if we're saying that light is the source and it is food, how important is it then to still be having protein based food that's coming from an animal source?
So I think the critical nutrients that are always going to be important, no matter where you live, or even what your latitude is, and to give us a short bit of context on that, uh, the if you think about the latitude as the main influence of guide to what we should be eating, that is how I think the most appropriate way of thinking about diet, which is if you live in northern Sweden in the winter, then there's no grasses growing, there's no um, wheat crop growing, and there's no plant matter growing. So the corollary there is that a strict carnivore diet is going to be the only way that it's possible to survive, and that's what we notice is the Inuit people, they almost exclusive animal based diet, because that was what they were exposed to. That's what there was available to them. So, carnivore is really like can be thought of as a wintertime diet at high latitude, and again by necessity of what's growing there. So as you go further towards the equator, there is more. There's things like tropical fruit which grow as a function of day length and ultraviolet light exposure, that are there and then present. So if we're getting plenty of ultraviolet light, because we're at the equator, then those foods become it's not a big a deal. But the issue that we have is that people are indoors. Most people are indoors all day from the beginning to the end of the day. They're not getting any ultraviolet light, so they're essentially and they're wearing sunglasses, so they're simulating essentially a wintertime environment, at least with their light exposures. Yet they're eating a summertime high carb diet, and that discrepancy is, in my opinion, what's really contributing to the rise of metabolic dysfunction and and type 2 diabetes and obesity, and that's really that incongruence between their light exposures and what they're putting in their mouth. The other point to make is that no matter where you sit on the dietary spectrum, it's, in my opinion, it's undeniable that the key nutrients that we need for optimal brain health are of animal origin, and these are things like vitamin B12 and DHA, docosahexaenoic acid. And if you look back into the history of the development of the human brain, then seafood was the marine food web was indispensable. And one way of thinking about this is you look at a zebra and a dolphin, or sorry, actually, probably a better example is a lion and a dolphin. They have similar body weights, and the dolphin's brain size is I think three times greater than the lion's brain size. And the point being that the marine food web has an abundance of this DHA fatty acid that allows the brain to essentially operate and grow in the nature in the way that it does. And if organisms and animals that have less DHA, they are unable to develop the neuronal complexity and therefore the the higher cognitive capability that those that have access to the marine food web do. So, and obviously vitamin B12, there is negligible to, well, there's no source of non-animal source of vitamin B12 that is in any way bioavailable. And so I would say that those two, the key importance of those two nutrients imply that humans were highly dependent to a very large degree on animal origin foods. But you can get around, like I was mentioning, this requirement or this kind of proportion of foods, I think, is fundamentally dependent on your light exposure and your light environment. And the more light that you get, the more carbohydrates that you can tolerate. And the more deranged your light environment, or the further north you live, then the more strict you have to be with something like a ketogenic or a low carb or a carnivore type diet.
And so then, does the light have the ability to produce certain hormones that will, I guess, replicate things like, what iron does, what magnesium does, what phosphorus does?
So the best way I think to think about it, it won't change your micronutrient requirements, and that's why there's always going to be need, as I mentioned, for preferably something like seafood. And seafood, because it contains so much abundance of animals, of trace minerals like zinc, iron, selenium, DHA, B12, iodine, that the brain needs. The issue in terms of the light exposures is that the more light you are able to harvest, the proportionally less food you need to consume. And that's might sound like a bit of an outlandish statement, but if you understand that the electron transport chain is the input into that is electrons, and the human body can actually harvest electrons via sunlight through ultraviolet light and through melanin, which is a pigment that traditionally associated with ultraviolet protection, and obviously has that function, but has also been demonstrated to act as have an ability to essentially harvest electrons from water to help power the body and power the mitochondrial colony. And the body's developed essentially hormonal pathways that reflect that the fact that it is able to derive energy from sunlight. And one of these, not to get too technical for your audience, but I think it's important to make the mention, is that there's one peptide. It's a pro-hormone called pro-opiomelanocortin, and it's essentially, the way to think about it is like a carnival ticket, and it gets cut up in various different sections. It's essentially stimulated by ultraviolet light. So where is ultraviolet light present? It's present when the sun is above a certain angle in the sky, and it is more prevalent during at equatorial regions, and obviously in summer at higher or lower latitudes. So what happens when ultraviolet light it actually stimulates the release of and cleavage of this carnival ticket, and one of those peptide hormones is called alpha MSH, and what alpha MSH does is in the skin, it helps to stimulate melanin synthesis and to make more melanin in the skin. But in the brain, it actually turns off satiety. So it turns off hunger, and it helps to increase feelings of fullness. And the way I think about it is that nature wouldn't have given us such a powerful function to turn off our hunger unless we were obviously able to be generating energy or deriving energy from that process. So, strong ultraviolet light is essentially providing a form of energy for the body, and it makes sense that as you go further away from the equator, and seasonally in somewhere like Sweden, where half the year there's no UV light, then the body's reliant more on food and electron inputs into the mitochondria.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. I want to quickly talk about water before we wrap up. You mentioned that the mitochondria produce water. So, does this make a difference to the kind of water we consume? Whether that's hydrogenated water, whether that's filtered water, whether it's deuterium depleted water, and if that's the case, what's the best way to source the water that's useful for us?
Yeah, it's a good question, and the way I think about it is it should be our first priority to help our bodies make as much of this water endogenously, this deuterium depleted water, as possible, and to explain, I guess, briefly the concept of deuterium is it's essentially a heavy isotope of hydrogen, and hydrogen, the way it gets used in that mitochondrial electron transport chain, the body needs to use the essentially the hydrogen, the plain hydrogen, but deuterium contains a neutron as well, so it's proton plus it's a hydrogen plus a neutron, so it actually has double the atomic mass, meaning that it can't get it doesn't process through that ATPase nanomotor anywhere near as efficiently. In fact, it actually breaks it, and the body's and life has gone through to amazing detail and effort to enzymatically remove any deuterium from the inputs into the electron transport chain, so that it doesn't have it doesn't break that nanomotor. So, how to create the most amount of deuterium depleted water is to optimize your environmental signals so that you have an abundance of red and infrared light, which you get from natural sunlight. But it's also to favor animal sourced fats and saturated animal fats, because by by volume or by unit, you make more deuterium depleted water in the mitochondria per unit from saturated animal fats than from carbohydrates or any other form of energy input. So, and one way of thinking about this is the value of the ketotic state in nutritional ketosis. And nutritional ketosis is extremely powerful, and that is being used therapeutically right now in a whole range of conditions, from metabolic syndrome and diabetes reversal to improving epilepsy function in epilepsy, improving symptoms of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's disease. So therapeutic ketosis is incredibly powerful, and one of the reasons why is because you're helping to produce more of that really deuterium depleted metabolic water in the mitochondria, and the mitochondrial function is therefore improved. As it relates to what type of water we drink, I think the influence on the whole body deuterium and how much deuterium actually exists in the body is going to be a function of also of what we're eating and what we're drinking, and that means that if we're drinking more deuterium depleted water sources, then that is likely to be more optimal. The point that I didn't make, which is it seems like the more ultraviolet light we're in, the greater the body's ability to excrete and deplete deuterium. So although you might live in a situation where there's more deuterium in the water because you live closer to the equator, and that's a natural gradient in the parts per million of water is actually closer to the poles, there's less, and closer to the equator, there's more. It seems that if you in a strong UV light environment, then you can essentially deplete that deuterium more effectively. But the takeaway point for people who are listening is using something like a natural spring water, especially if it's perhaps from more of a southern latitude, you're probably likelier to get less deuterium than you are from, say, obviously from tap water or domestic water source.
I have so many more questions, but I'm mindful of time. Out of everything that we've talked about, you've mentioned things like latitude and the impact that that has on what we can form in our bodies. And so just thinking about Australians and our lifestyle over here, we have different ethnicities that are based in Australia into something a little bit more specific. So melanin and how that has an impact with the light that we're absorbing from sunlight. How is that then going to impact on the lifestyle that we live? So if we're comparing a black-skinned person to a brown-skinned person to a white-skinned person.
Yeah, it's a really important question, and one that maybe has been not asked as much as it should have because of perhaps political correctness. But the variation in skin pigment has a massive impact on health because it determines what our light needs are, what our ultraviolet light needs are. And although ultraviolet light has been maligned and I would say demonized in Australia because of its because of the skin cancer link, what that extremist viewpoint doesn't recognize is that UV light is an essential light nutrient that the body is actually using not only to derive energy, as we mentioned before, but also to run a whole bunch of hormonal processes, and obviously vitamin D is probably the most well known one. So the more melanin that someone has in their skin, in their epidermis, then the more efficient they are at blocking ultraviolet light, and therefore the more UV light they need to remain healthy. So you can think about the health consequences of insufficient UV light in by looking at the literature of vitamin D deficiency and how it's associated with metabolic syndrome, all metabolic diseases, whole bunch of cancers, you name it, all cause mortality. Then you've got vitamin D deficiency as a risk factor. So the biggest issue here is if you're, say, a darker skinned person living in Tasmania, then there's not enough ultraviolet light in the environment to satisfy your needs. And it's much easier if you're a pale-skinned Aussie of Irish descent to exist in this higher UV yield environment because you can simply use the shade to titrate your UV dose and be sensible so that you can get your needs met without overcooking it, so to speak. So that's the kind of the real breakdown. But the point I would make is that the narratives around the sun, yes, we have an incredibly high incidence of skin cancer and melanoma in Australia. But what I would like to see is more nuanced advice that recognizes that this is an essential health component and is more specific in advising people. And look, maybe the easiest way of thinking about this is compare yourself to the people that natively lived in the area that you are. If you're a lot lighter than them, then there's a whole bunch more UV light in the environment than your needs, and in which case you need to use the shade. But if you're darker or the same color as the people that naturally lived at that latitude or that environment, then you shouldn't be putting sunscreen on, and you shouldn't be covering yourself from the sun because you've been given the right amount of melanin for your ambient conditions. And being intentional and understanding that is really important. So, if you're from South India and you're probably, and you have very dark skin, then, that's appropriate to Queensland, a Queensland UV environment. I mean, they're probably they're quite similar. But again, if you're from Nigeria and then you've decided to live in Hobart, then maybe you want to make some steps to mitigate what I call that light, the UV latitude mismatch, which is very important.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Max. I'd love to finish off with 3 questions that I like to ask my guest speakers. The first one being, what would you like to see for the future of health and well-being?
So I would really like to see funding for some of these essential questions of health, decentralized health, that aren't being asked and aren't being funded. And there are a whole bunch of researchers who are doing amazing work on research on the effects of light and how they interact with our cardiovascular physiology or our our brain or the non-visual photoreceptor system in our circadian rhythms, but they're simply just not being investigated. So I would like to see funding for these critical topics that aren't being funded at the moment.
Amazing. Second question being, what's your favorite occupation to engage in? Occupation being any activity.
My favorite activity to to engage in. Look, it's really fun to come on podcasts like this and talk to people who are asking good questions and learn myself and educate about health. I think I get a lot of pleasure out of that, and that's why I do my own podcast, because I'm a very curious person. I find things very interesting, and to be able to talk about these topics it gives me a lot of joy and satisfaction.
And the last one being, what are 3 resources you can recommend to someone who is new to the decentralized world and is wanting to make changes?
Yeah, so if they're just starting out on their journey and they want to, I guess, start from the ground floor, and maybe I'll shamelessly plug my podcast, start at episode 1 of the Regenerative Health podcast. That's that's a great resource. I would also recommend in some doses to check out the work of Dr. Jack Kruse. It can be like drinking from a fire hose, but maybe in work your way up and try and understand what he's saying, because he's someone who's come from a centralized system and essentially one of the founders or builders who've mapped out, I guess, hacked their way through the forest to map a path out for us, the rest of us, to understand health from a decentralized perspective or point of view. And then the third resource that I'd probably have to recommend, and this is more from a dietary side of things, is to check out Low Carb Down Under. They're a group of videos, and maybe more so for any doctors listening, but their experience of treating people therapeutically with low carb and ketogenic diets and having amazing results.
Sorry, what was that on YouTube?
Low Carb Down Under.
What was that?
Yeah.
Okay, Low Carb Down Under.
Yeah.
Amazing. Thanks so much.
No worries, Shardo. It was nice to talk.
Well, this is where your journey of exploration continues. Please subscribe to the Lifeability podcast so that you can stay tuned when new episodes come online. You can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram. The mission at Lifeability is to inspire you to create a more fulfilling life for yourself and improve your quality of life. So why not share this podcast with your loved ones and create a ripple effect together? Until next time, Asante Sana.